Security for us. We want to continue the conversation right now and get some insights out of Tina Fordham. She's the founder and geopolitical strategist at Fordham Global Foresight. And Tina, let's start off here with the U.S. response. We heard, of course, Joe Biden making it clear that the U.S. government policy is to stand behind and stand steadfast behind Israel here. Do you think we're going to see a meaningful uptick in spending on this conflict relative to, I guess, what we already commit to Israel on an annual basis now?
Well, I think spending is just one signal. I think the more powerful signal, as Nick mentioned, was the relocation of strike carriers to Israel. I mean, that's U.S. security and defense putting its money where its mouth is. I think market participants are really being overly complacent about the geopolitical contagion of this conflict and the fact that it's taking place against a much more complex economic and fiscal policy background compared to 2006. I was at Citi as the chief global political analyst at that stage, and your previous speaker is right that most of these exchanges of fire and other kinds of examples of conflict had a very short-lived impact. But just as we can compare to how we've seen many skirmishes in the Middle East, we also need to compare how this time is different.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because I am curious, Tina, when we think about past conflicts, and not just attacks on Israel itself, but we even go back to 9/11 here in the States, as well as other conflicts where you had actors in the Middle East clearly trying to pull the U.S. and, for that matter, Israel into these broader conflicts here. And we know in the past there's been a lot of restraint shown. This does feel a lot different, just in terms of the rhetoric that we've heard out of the Israeli leaders just over the last couple of days, as well as their allies here. And we know that this isn't really so much about whether Israel goes into Gaza. A lot of this has to do with what's Iran's role in this? Will there be a direct response to Iran? And what are other allies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, what position are they going to take?
Absolutely right. And that's where the notion of the interlinkage of this crisis is, again, I think, being glossed over by market participants. I talk about the geopolitical risk supercycle and how it's no coincidence that Hamas chose this time to attack. They got very lucky, but also Serbia-Kosovo tensions ramping up, Azerbaijan and Armenia. This is a great time for opportunistic actors to settle scores, gain advantage, etc. I think another point I'd make is that Hamas is starting to act a lot like ISIS, and that factor is also going to have an impact for the response that Israel takes, the kind of vengeance, if you will. They've announced recently that they're starting to execute their civilian prisoners and televising it. Don't underestimate what that's going to do to the scale of the Israeli response.
And Tina, I also want to get your thoughts on the state of intelligence, basically. That's been one of the big topics over the past couple days, is why was this a surprise? And when you think about Israel's response, how does that extend to their surveillance, to their intelligence and those efforts?
Well, this is where PM Netanyahu is really at risk, right? We don't know whether his security services warned of this and his government failed to act. There are all kinds of rumors flying around, but at the end of the day, this happened on his watch. And I doubt he will be able to escape the blame. It's not surprising with that in mind that he called for a government of national unity, and the protests that have undermined support for his government obviously will stop. Reservists are reporting for duty and everything else, because for Israel, like for Ukraine, this is an existential crisis.
An existential crisis. And with that in mind, when you think about the support that the U.S. has pledged, of course, to Israel, how might that factor into the support that the U.S. is currently providing to Ukraine? Is there a relationship that can be drawn there?
Listen, in the case of Israel, there's an explicit U.S. security guarantee. In the case of Ukraine, the U.S. does not have an explicit security guarantee in that Ukraine is not a NATO member state. But in both cases, the U.S. is involved in two major wars, both of which have the potential to become systemic. And that is a word that market participants need to understand distinguishes both of these conflicts from others like Afghanistan, like Somalia, et cetera, where the U.S. has been involved, meaning there's a transmission mechanism to markets. The oil price, yes, but if Israel attacks Iran, that is a major shock and one that I don't think that investors are prepared for. We've also got to remember that there isn't a lot of fiscal headroom in governments at the moment.
Tina, really appreciate your perspective on a day like today. Our thanks to Tina Fordham of Fordham Global Foresight. Coming up on The Close, oil surging after Hamas's surprise attack on Israel. We'll discuss the impact on energy next. This is Bloomberg.